My name is Raquel Garcia, and this is my presentation for my final case study project. So I just kind of broke down the presentation into like my paper, and so we'll just be talking a little bit about each section of the paper. So I'm going to start first with the methods. So I did do two sets of in-person interviews. I did have the participants come over to my home. Well, the first one, they came over to my home. The second one I did in their home. And then we did a third visit where I accompanied the family on a weekend, where to a local like flea market where they sell items on the weekends. That's what they do. So I accompanied them on that weekend, and we kind of just talked and to see how they engage with other people in the community, how they talk with each other. So that was actually a lot of fun. So I'm just going to talk about a little bit about the actual participants. So it is a family of three. It's mom, dad, and their daughter. And so the reason why I wanted to focus on this particular family was because they do all range in age and stages in life. And although they are a family, their immigration stories are very different from each other. So it kind of makes all each set of interviews and everything we talked about is just very unique, and they provide a different perspective. So it was very interesting to talk to each individual and then just kind of get their story and how they how they live their life in Mexico, how they live their life here, and how a lot of the things just have affected their lives overall. As I we did interviews and collected artifacts and did all that, I was able to see four evident themes, which I did talk about in my previous, like my second research memo. But I kind of continued with that because that is what I saw after having conducted the interviews and like visiting them and interacting with them. So the four evident themes were acceptance, which is the participants are often reluctant, I guess, to accept that they are, in fact, immigrants. The second one was assimilation. So the participants demonstrated strong assimilation tendencies, and not just cultural assimilation, but also like linguistic assimilation, which is also in part, I guess, with the code switching because I guess they go hand in hand to me. Code switching participants often spoke um, in like code switching between English and Spanish. And then the fourth theme that I did notice was like phonetic spelling, which was evident in the artifacts that I collected. So we're going to talk about the first theme, which was acceptance or difficulty with acceptance. With the data from this study, we can make conclusions about how difficult it was for the participants to adjust to a transnational life. Shame and difficulty with acceptance were evident throughout this study. These themes are important as they play a vital role in the participants' journeys. So with our first, one of our participants, his name was Carlos. Of course, we gave everybody pseudonyms, but for the purpose of the study, we call him Carlos. So his story is rather interesting because he was born in Mexico, but he was immediately brought over to the United States. I believe he was like one. That's what he had said. He was a 1 year old, and so he was basically raised in the United States up until the age of 40. He lived here. So it says, it was like he went to elementary, middle school, high school. He didn't complete his high school. He didn't receive a high school diploma. But I mean, he basically lived here his entire life. And so he kind of doesn't really like to admit that he is an immigrant because he's undocumented, So and he just feels like he is an American. He was raised here. He went to school here. And he says that he doesn't know Spanish. is what he consistently kept on telling me. Um, Despite the fact that these interviews were conducted in Spanish. But he says that Spanish is not his primary language. He says English is his primary language, that he speaks it and writes it. And so it is very hard for him to admit that he is an immigrant. And then at the age of 40, he decided to go back to Mexico. He said that he wanted a change of scenery. So he ended up going back to Mexico, where he lived about 3 years, I believe is what he said, where he was a taxi driver, and he lived there for a while, which is where he met his wife, and then they decided to move back to the United States together. I did ask him if he would like to ever return to Mexico, and he says no. He says he would not, that he feels like he has a better life here in the United States. And so it's just very interesting. We conversing with him, going back and forth, but he was very almost like ashamed or like embarrassed to say that he was born in Mexico. But that was what I noticed with him. It's about more so with Carlos and the other three participants. I noticed different things, but this was more specifically with this participant. Which brings me to my next theme, which is code switching. Throughout the interviews conducted with this study, Carlos and Jessica is their daughter. Again, it's another pseudonym. She is 19. So with Carlos and Jessica, both they practiced a lot of code switching between English and Spanish, especially when Jessica began talking about her school, and Carlos was talking about like his line of work. They did a lot of code switching back and forth with English and Spanish. So I did put some with the transcribing. I'm sorry. So I could see I was talking to Jessica, and she kept on saying words like she would talk in Spanish, and she said, "Cuando llegué aquí me pusieron en fifth grade," and she would say particular like words in English. And then she says, "Pero yo debería de haber estado en sixth grade." And so I put that in my transcription because and she was born in Mexico. She lived a longer over there. Because her mom and dad didn't meet until when Carlos returned at the age of 40. That's when they met. So Jessica was pretty much raised in Mexico. She was born there, and then she didn't come over until the age of 12. So she went to school, elementary school, primary school over there. So her primary language was Spanish. She learned to read Spanish, write Spanish. She speaks Spanish very well. So those words in particular, elementary school, middle school, high school, fifth grade, sixth grade, those words, she didn't learn those words until she was about 12 years old when she moved over here. So she's never ever used those words in a different context. She's never had to say them in English, in Spanish. And it was the same thing with Carlos when he was talking about his work. He says, "Trabajo en los vents." He would say, "Hacemos varios tipos de trabajo, pero hacemos vents. También hacemos cooling y a veces ponemos insulation." So he would say those particular words in English. Of course, those are words that he uses on a daily basis in his line of work. So there was a lot of code switching going on back and forth throughout the interviews, and everything's transcribed in there. We move on to the next theme. So my third theme that I did notice was assimilation. Cultural and linguistic assimilation were evident with the participants. So Carlos has adopted English, like I said, as his primary language since a young age. And although Jessica learned to speak, read, and write in Spanish in Mexico, she now practices English in her work and social life. So she struggled a little more to pick it up because since she was brought over to the United States at the age of 12, so she started school, I believe. Well, she was supposed to be placed in fifth grade, but she was retained and placed in. She was supposed to be placed in sixth grade. I'm sorry, but she was retained and placed in fifth grade because she was a recent immigrant. So she had to learn basically the entire English language, how to read, how to write, how to speak. and she was already 12. So I can't. It was very difficult for her. So even just we're talking about the language, so she did have to assimilate language, and then she did also have to like the social constructs. So Carlos was telling me about how they now like engage in like watching football, which is a very American thing to do. I don't think it's a very common sport in Mexico. And Jessica actually went as far as to join a girls' flag football team in high school, which is, I don't believe, something she would have done back in Mexico. So they've assimilated to that sort of like, thing that they do together, and that it has become like a bonding activity for the two. Um, Let me move on to my next and final theme, which was phonetic spelling. And this is mainly with Rosario because Rosario is the one that struggles mainly now because Carlos and Jessica both do regularly speak English. But Rosario, again, a pseudonym, his mom, Rosario was lived in Mexico her entire life. She has only been living in the United States for the past 7 years, 7 years. So that's not very much time, having all her childhood and basically her entire life, most of her life in Mexico, a different country, a different language, a different culture, and then having to move over here at a later age. So she does not. She says she does not speak English. She barely understands a little, but sometimes Jessica and Carlos are having conversations amongst themselves, talking about football, talking about movies, and she has no clue what's going on because she really doesn't understand um, English. So some of the things that I noticed with her, particularly when like a grocery list, some of the when she's writing and trying to use words in English, she does use a lot of phonetic spelling patterns. So I made a connection with an article by or a study by Young and Lyle. I don't want to mispronounce it. It says when beginning spellers make guesses about a word's constituent letters, their errors reveal the kinds of metalinguistic knowledge they rely on prior to extensive exposure to print. So basically, Rosario will use the tools that she has in her capabilities, such as her knowledge of Spanish letter names and sounds, when she's trying to write things in English. So it's evident that she just doesn't have enough knowledge of the English phonics rules to write English correctly. Um, so let's just break it down with the discussions and implications. Number one, so communities and schools house a large number of immigrant children at the moment. So according to Texas data on immigrant students, on the higher ed immigration portal, this was from 2022, it says the U.S. is home to more than 427,000 undocumented students. So a lot of this situation, I'm sure it's similar throughout the United States in different campuses and different districts. So students, just as Jessica herself, and I've experienced it in my own classroom when I get students that are recent immigrants. So, which brings me to my second point: educators, parents, communities around the U.S. We need to have the tools and understanding of how English language learners acquire, that second language. Also, immigrants have to adapt to a new lifestyle. It's a new language culture. It's a whole new experience. I remember a couple of years ago when I had a little boy struggling with money, with like coins. I didn't understand why he was having such a hard time. Spoke with mom, and she's like, "Oh, it's we just moved here like last year, so this currency is completely foreign to this child." Like they were already, it was already later on in the year, and they were older. It wasn't like what grade was this? Third grade, I believe. Little boy was just at a loss. Like the coins didn't make any sense to him. I was like, why doesn't this little boy know what a penny is? But it's not the currency they use. So it was just completely foreign to him. So things like that make a big difference. So number 4 says literacy practices. So sometimes, these things are either done purposely or subconsciously, but essentially this is what builds the foundation in these participants and these students and and anyone basically. And so I think a lot about my own literary journey and things that my mother did when we were children, and how that impacted the way that I learned to read and that I maintained my Spanish, because they were immigrants, and so they didn't know any English. But she continued to read to us in Spanish and provide that literature in Spanish. So I was able to acquire a second language fairly quickly because of it. Um, which number 5 says teaching should occur in a context that is compatible with the culture of the learner. So of course we do need to incorporate and allow these students to continue engaging with their native languages, as to not lose, their native language, and still be able to have second language acquisition. So I hope to learn something new today. Thank you for listening and have a nice day. Thank you.